It's the quiet that gets you. Always the quiet. I should have known the second we stepped into that part of the city. No wind, no birds, no distant groaning from the dead. Just stillness, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something awful to happen. But we were desperate. We had no choice. There were too many mouths back at the wall and not enough food. So we kept moving. That's how you get killed out here, when you keep moving when your gut tells you to turn back. We found a building, what looked like an old store, maybe an office. The door was half hanging off its hinges, creaking in the still air. I could feel the unease sinking into my bones, but I pushed through it. There's no room for second guessing in the wasteland. Inside, it was the same as always. Ruins, decay, the stink of mold. Blood on the walls, but no bodies, just stains. Like whoever had been there had been wiped off the face of the earth, leaving only their pain behind. And then, I heard it. A whisper. Faint, like it was riding the wind, but there was no wind. The sound crawled through the silence, barely there, twisting its way through the room. "Do you hear that?" Maria asked, her voice a trembling whisper. I nodded. I heard it too. The others were already on edge, hands gripping their weapons tighter, eyes darting to every corner. But the thing was, there was no thing. Just that whispering. Soft, almost soothing, if it weren't for the fact that it was getting louder. "Stay close," I said, my voice rough, barely above a whisper itself. No splitting up. We moved cautiously through the building, every step slower than the last. The air was thick with dust, swirling in the dim light from the cracked windows. The further we went, the louder the whispers became. It wasn't just in one direction, it was everywhere, surrounding us, wrapping around our throats like a noose. Then it happened. A scream, a sharp, piercing scream, cut through the whispers. We spun around just in time to see one of the others, Jack, dragged back into the darkness, his legs kicking wildly as he was pulled into a narrow hallway. The sound was cut off as quickly as it had started, and the silence returned. I ran toward the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I got there, all that was left was blood. The trail led further into the shadows, smearing across the floor in thick streaks. Jack was gone. "Back to the entrance," I ordered, my voice shaking. "Now." Maria was already moving, her breathing coming out in sharp, panicked bursts. We retraced our steps, but every corner, every shadow felt alive. The whispers were louder now, like they were inside my head, slithering into my ears, making it hard to think. We reached the front of the building, but just as I thought we were in the clear, I heard a faint, wet sound behind us. The quiet crack of bones shifting. Then, out of the dark, it came. A figure, gaunt and twisted, its skin stretched tight over bones, lunged at Maria. It didn't make a sound as it slammed her into the ground. Her scream was muffled, cut off as the thing's sharp fingers tore into her throat, digging deep into her flesh. Blood sprayed across the walls, splattering in thick, dark arcs, but she couldn't scream. Her body twitched as she tried to claw at the creature, but she was already gone. I froze, staring at the scene in horror. It was fast. So fast. The way the creature's bony fingers dug under her skin, pulling flesh and muscle apart with ease, without a single sound escaping its mouth. The rest of the group ran. I was next to go, pulling back toward the door, watching as the thing hunched over Maria's body, ripping into her chest, her blood pooling under its feet. There was no time for grief. No time to think. Just survival. As I stumbled out into the street, I heard it. The whispers. Faint again. Almost like they were laughing at us, mocking the quiet we'd thought was safe. I didn't know what had just happened. Not fully. But I knew this. The quiet wasn't safety. The quiet was death, waiting to tear us apart. And the whisperers thrived in silence. We didn't speak after Maria went down. No one dared to. It felt like the silence had swallowed her whole, and if we even whispered, we'd be next. The air was thick with the smell of blood, clinging to my clothes and filling my lungs with every shallow breath. The others, Jacob and Daniel, were pale, their eyes wide with panic. We all knew it. We were being hunted, and those things were fast, too fast. I forced us to move quickly, trying to ignore the echoes of Maria's last moments. Her blood spraying the walls, the wet sound of her flesh being torn away, the way her scream was cut off like someone had flipped a switch. She was gone in seconds, her body ripped open and empty before I could even react. "We have to get out of here," Jacob hissed, his voice barely more than a breath. His hands were shaking, his rifle clutched so tightly I thought he might snap it in two. I nodded. "Stay close, and don't make a sound." We moved through the building, sticking to the walls, our footsteps light. The whispers were everywhere now, curling through the hallways, seeping into the cracks in the walls. They were louder than before, more insistent, like they were taunting us, leading us into a trap. I don't know how long we wandered through that maze of ruined rooms and blood-streaked corridors. Every time I thought we were making progress, we'd hear something. Soft footsteps, a faint rustle of movement, and we'd freeze, waiting for the inevitable attack. But the Whisperers didn't strike right away. They were patient, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment. The tension was unbearable. Jacob was losing it, his breathing quick and ragged. Daniel wasn't much better, his eyes darting back and forth like a caged animal, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. But it didn't matter how fast we were. You couldn't outrun the silence. We turned a corner, and that's when it happened. Out of the shadows, something shot forward, a blur of pale skin and bone. It hit Jacob first, slamming into him so hard he didn't even have time to scream. The thing's hands, bony and sharp like claws, plunged into his chest, tearing through his ribs with a sickening crunch. Blood sprayed across the floor, warm and sticky, as Jacob's eyes went wide in shock, his mouth opening in a silent scream. But no sound came out, just a choking gurgle as the creature ripped him apart. The thing didn't stop. It worked quickly, its movements almost mechanical, its fingers digging through flesh and bone like it was harvesting something, not killing. The sound of tearing skin, snapping bones. It all blended into the silence, and Jacob was gone. Gone before we could even move. "Run!" I shouted, the word strangled as it left my throat. Daniel bolted, and I was right behind him. But the thing, the Whisperer, was already on the move again. I could hear it behind us, that soft shuffle of feet, like a ghost gliding over the blood-slick floor. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The smell of Jacob's blood clung to me, sharp and metallic, mixing with the musty air of the ruined building. I could hear my own breath, quick and shallow, my heart hammering in my chest. Daniel was ahead of me, his footsteps echoing through the hallways. But I knew we wouldn't make it far. Not if that thing kept following us. We rounded another corner, bursting into a large room that might have been a storage area once. It was mostly empty now, except for a few broken crates and piles of debris. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. Daniel stopped dead in his tracks, his face pale with terror. "What do we do?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The Whisperer was close. I could feel it, like a weight pressing down on my chest. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with a low, constant hum. It was waiting for us to make a mistake, waiting for one of us to break the silence. I gripped my machete, my knuckles white. "We fight," I said, though my voice shook. "We don't have a choice." But before we could move, the thing was there. It came from the shadows, its gaunt face twisted into something that barely resembled human. Its skin was stretched thin, tight over bones that jutted out at sharp angles. Its eyes were hollow, empty, and its mouth moved in a silent whisper, lips curling back to reveal sharp, broken teeth. Blood dripped from its fingers, pooling at its feet. Daniel made the mistake of screaming. The Whisperer moved in a flash, its bony hand grabbing him by the throat, silencing him before he could make another sound. It lifted him off the ground with terrifying ease, its fingers tightening around his neck, squeezing until blood vessels burst beneath his skin. Daniel's legs kicked wildly, his hands clawing at the Whisperer's arm, but it was no use. The Whisperer slammed him into the ground, and the sound of Daniel's skull cracking against the concrete was the only thing that echoed through the room. Blood pooled around his head, thick and dark, seeping into the cracks in the floor. His body twitched once, twice, then went still. I didn't wait. I lunged at the thing, swinging my machete with all the strength I had left. The blade connected with its shoulder, cutting deep into its flesh, but the Whisperer barely flinched. No blood poured from the wound, just a faint, wheezing hiss from its mouth as it turned toward me, its empty eyes locking onto mine. I pulled the machete free and swung again, this time aiming for its head. The blade buried itself in its neck, the sharp edge biting through bone with a sickening crunch. But still, the thing didn't fall. It staggered back, its fingers twitching, reaching for me as if it couldn't understand that it was dying. With a final heave, I yanked the machete free and brought it down again, this time splitting its skull in two. The Whisperer crumpled to the ground, its body twitching in death, and the room was filled with silence once more. I stood there covered in blood, staring down at the thing's body. My breath came in ragged gasps, my hands shaking around the handle of my machete. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. Not in this silence. Not when the quiet was still watching. I wish I could say I made it back to the wall easily, but that would be a lie. After Daniel's body hit the floor with that final bone-cracking thud, I was the last one standing. The others, gone, torn apart, bled out, or worse. And it was all because of the quiet. I stood there, panting, my hands shaking as I stared at the Whisperer's lifeless body. Its head was split wide open, bone and brain matter leaking onto the concrete. My machete was still lodged in its skull, blood oozing down the blade, slicking the handle. But I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The silence hung in the air like a suffocating blanket, pressing down on me, filling the room with an unbearable weight. I yanked the machete free, the blade making a sickening wet sound as it slid out of the Whisperer's skull. The moment I did, the whispers came back. Softer now. Distant, but still there. Like they were taunting me, reminding me that I wasn't safe. Not yet. I needed to get out of that building. I needed to run. But as I turned toward the door, I heard it. Another whisper. This one louder. Closer. I froze, heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The Whisperers weren't done. I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The door at the far end of the room creaked open, and another one of them stepped into the light. It moved slowly, its gaunt frame hunched, its skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow, just like the others, but there was something different about this one. It was bigger, stronger, and it wasn't alone. Two more Whisperers followed behind it, their bodies moving in eerie, synchronized silence, their mouths twisted into that same grotesque half-grin. I backed up, my grip tightening on the machete, my knuckles white with fear. I couldn't fight them all. Not this time. The first one moved fast, lunging toward me with its arms outstretched, its fingers curled into claws. I swung the machete, the blade cutting deep into its shoulder, but it didn't slow down. It grabbed my arm, its grip ice cold, and yanked me forward. I stumbled, barely managing to pull the machete free before I hit the ground. It was on top of me in seconds, its teeth snapping inches from my face. I swung again, this time burying the blade in its neck. But the other two were already closing in. They didn't make a sound, not even a breath, as they moved. It was like the silence itself was controlling them, guiding them toward me. I pushed the first Whisperer off me and scrambled to my feet, blood dripping from the machete. I couldn't fight them, not all of them. I had to run. I turned and bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my ears, the whispers growing louder with every step. They were following me. I could feel it. Their cold, dead eyes watching, their hands reaching for me through the dark. I burst through the door and into the open air, my lungs burning, my legs shaking with exhaustion. The whispers didn't stop. I ran through the streets, ducking into alleys, weaving between broken-down cars and piles of rubble. Every shadow felt like it was closing in on me, every corner a trap waiting to spring. But I kept moving, driven by the fear gnawing at the back of my mind. The fear of what would happen if I stopped. I don't know how long I ran. Hours, maybe. Long enough for the sun to start dipping behind the horizon, casting the city in a blood-red glow. The whispers faded the further I got from the building, but they never disappeared entirely. They were always there, lurking, waiting for me to let my guard down. By the time I reached the outskirts of the city, I was barely standing. My body was covered in blood, most of it not mine. and my hands were shaking so badly I could hardly grip the machete anymore. The wall loomed ahead of me, a jagged silhouette against the darkening sky. Safety. At least for now. When I finally stumbled through the gates, collapsing onto the cold, hard ground, I knew I'd made it. I was alive. But the others? They weren't. The Whisperers had taken them, and it was all because of the silence. The quiet had lulled us into a false sense of security, made us think we were safe when we were anything but. As I lay there, staring up at the sky, the last of the whispers fading into the night, I knew what I had to do. The wall needed rules. Rules to keep us alive, to keep us from making the same mistakes again. And the rule I wrote that night? Do not trust the quiet. Because the Whisperers, they thrive in it.